The air inside Ethelred was perpetually filtered, scrubbed clean of organic particulates, and stabilized at a constant 21.5 degrees Celsius. Yet it carried a faint, unsettling metallic tang, an ozone residue hinting at the massive energy expenditure required to sustain the illusion of normalcy. Elias inhaled deeply, the action automatic after 17 years within the monolithic structure, and the synthesized oxygen felt thin, almost brittle, against the lining of his lungs. He stood in his designated habitation unit, Unit 44 Gamma, a space defined by walls of seamless, silica-infused polymer that reflected the omnipresent, shadowless light source, a perfect, non-directional imitation of mid-morning sun. There were no windows, only high-definition projection fields displaying an endless loop of temperate forest canopy, the leaves swaying in a non-existent breeze. The routine was the anchor. Rise at the sonic chime, ingest the standard nutrient slurry, designated Formula 73 Delta, delivered via automated induction port, calibrated to provide precisely 2,100 kilocalories and essential micronutrients, tasting faintly of synthesized vanilla and chalk. Then, the mandatory cognitive optimization session, followed by the communal maintenance period in the central hydroponics bay. Compliance was the highest virtue, and for years, Elias had been a model citizen of the Enclave, his biosignature readings consistently registering low stress and high equilibrium. He had believed implicitly in the narrative. Ethelred was the Ark, the final bastion of human ingenuity, protecting them from the toxic, irradiated desolation of the threshold above. But the perfection was beginning to fray. It started subtly, a sensory decay that the Enclave's meticulous systems could not fully mask. Yesterday, during the optimization session, the projection field had stuttered. Not a full glitch, not a blackout, but a microsecond of visual misalignment, where the lush green canopy fractured into a grid of pure dead pixels. Elias had reported the anomaly via his wrist-mounted diagnostic interface, but the automated response system integrity, nominal. User equilibrium, Stable had dismissed the observation, classifying it as a temporary ocular fatigue event. Today, the disturbance was auditory. The Enclave was built on silence, punctuated only by the low, constant hum of the atmospheric regulators and the laminar flow ventilation system, a sound so pervasive it became the absence of sound. As Elias moved through the Transit Corridor 7, a section reserved for personnel with Level 3 clearance, he heard something that defied the physics of Ethelred's structural engineering, a reverberation. It was a low-frequency thrum, deep and resonant, originating not from the internal machinery, but seemingly from beyond the primary containment shell. It was the sound of something immense shifting, a groan of stressed ferrocrete under impossible pressure. He stopped, pressing his palm against the cool polymer wall. His movement triggered an immediate diagnostic scan. A faint, red laser briefly tracked his retina and heart rate. He forced his breathing to remain slow, mimicking the calm state the curators demanded. The reverberation faded, leaving behind only the familiar sterile drone. Elias knew the technical specifications of the shell intimately. The Enclave was buried 800 meters beneath the surface, protected by a triple redundancy kinetic absorption barrier and walls composed of high-density depleted uranium alloys encased in shock-resistant graphene sheeting. Nothing, not seismic activity, nor residual atmospheric collapse, should penetrate that deep. The structure was designed to be immutable. He continued toward the hydroponics bay, but deviated slightly, pulling his clearance key for a defunct utility junction marked J19, a section officially sealed 3 cycles ago due to non-critical thermal leakage. The utility port was shielded by a standard electromagnetic lock, but Elias had spent the last 3 weeks compiling the necessary override sequence, exploiting a known vulnerability in the legacy power distribution algorithms. The lock disengaged with a barely audible click, a sound swallowed instantly by the constant ambient noise. The air inside J-19 was colder, denser, and smelled faintly of ozone and stale metal, the true scent of Aether-Red's operational core. Unfiltered, he activated the inspection light on his interface. The junction box was a tangle of heavy-gauge cabling and inert pressure regulators. But behind the main power conduit, where the schematics claimed there was only solid, reinforced structural support, Elias found a seam. It was hair-thin, almost invisible, running vertically down the ferrocrete slab. He ran his gloved finger along the seam. The surface felt granular, not the smooth polymer finish. It was a maintenance access panel, crudely sealed and disguised with a layer of synthetic stucco applied hastily over the joint. This panel was not in any authorized blueprint. He inserted the edge of his utility wedge into the gap and applied steady pressure. The panel didn't budge, but the low-frequency thrum returned, closer this time, vibrating through the metal of the wedge and into the bones of his hand. It wasn't the sound of the structure settling. It was the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of something vast and active, something the curators insisted did not exist. The Enclave was not merely sustained. It was actively processing something horrifying, just beyond the facade. The utility wedge proved insufficient. The seal was not merely adhesive. It was fused, likely a molecular bonding agent applied under high pressure, designed to be structurally integral to the ferrocrete. Elias withdrew the wedge, the low-frequency vibration still resonating through the tool's handle, a constant physical reminder of the lie. He needed a different approach, one that exploited material fatigue rather than brute force. From his belt kit, disguised as a standard field calibration unit, he extracted a micropulse thermal generator. It was strictly unauthorized, capable of delivering focused, high-intensity heat shockwaves designed to shatter crystalline structures without causing bulk thermal expansion. A perfect countermeasure for the high-density aggregate used in Ethelred's construction. He set the generator to cycle through 4 distinct frequencies, meticulously calibrated to the ferrosilicate compounds, targeting the silicon carbide lattice within the synthetic stucco disguise. This process was a precise, calculated act of material sabotage, designed to induce microfractures in the binder matrix. The device emitted no visible light, only a faint, high-pitched whine that was immediately masked by the constant white noise of the J19 junction's inner cooling fans. For 60 seconds, the generator worked, stressing the scene. The ferrocrete, engineered to withstand megaton yields, was slowly being disassembled at a molecular level, the structural integrity of the seal compromised by targeted thermal violence. When the timer hit 0, Elias didn't wait. He reapplied the utility wedge, inserting the sharpened iridium tip precisely where the thermal shock had been focused. This time, the resistance gave way not with a snap, but a slow, grating tear, like ripping heavy canvas. The panel, a slab of reinforced composite nearly 10 centimeters thick, swung inward silently, counterbalanced by internal pneumatic pistons, revealing not a maintenance plenum, but a vertical shaft descending into absolute lightless depth. The air that rushed out was a shock. It was intensely cold, far below the ambient 22 degrees Celsius maintained throughout the Enclave, and carried a metallic, corrosive scent mixed with the sharp, sweet smell of ozone and something akin to burned sugar, the byproduct of massive, inefficient energy conversion. The thrum intensified immediately, no longer a distant rumble, but a crushing kinetic presence. It was a 2.5 Hz oscillation, deep and rhythmic, consistent with the cycling of immense superconducting magnetic coils designed to contain or accelerate something impossibly heavy. It suggested inertial dampeners operating far beyond the stress tolerances of the primary containment shell, pushing the very limits of known physics and structural endurance. Elias secured a safety line to a heavy-gauge power conduit, a redundant feed for the level, 5 environmental controls, and clipped his diagnostic interface to his chest harness. He engaged the shaft's descent mechanism, a narrow, motorized rail system designed for single-person access, though officially decommissioned 2 decades prior under the guise of efficiency consolidation. The shaft walls were lined with heavy, dense, lead-impregnated polymer sheeting, layered nearly 5 centimeters thick. This material was engineered not for kinetic absorption or sound dampening, but specifically for high-energy gamma and neutron radiation shielding. The curators hadn't just lied about the bedrock. They had actively attempted to erase the physical evidence of this necessary defense. This was the first definitive proof. The area below level 5, the mythical foundation level, the curators claimed was inert bedrock, was actively processing or containing something highly energetic and dangerous. As he descended, the ambient temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the air thickened, making breathing labored despite the filtered supply in his harness. The light from his inspection lamp barely pierced the gloom, scattering weakly against the dense, lead-laced polymer. He realized the thrum was not continuous. It peaked every 3.8 seconds, a massive energy draw followed by a momentary, terrifying silence, only to resume its crushing cycle. He calculated the descent rate based on the rail system's known specifications. He reached the bottom of the shaft after a descent that felt impossibly long, perhaps 150 meters vertically, placing him nearly a kilometer beneath the surface and far below the official structural base of the Enclave. The shaft terminated in a narrow service catwalk overlooking a vast, cavernous space. This space was not ferrocrete and polymer. It was rough-hewn ancient granite, carved directly into the planet's crust with tools of prodigious power. The walls were then meticulously lined with massive, interlocking plates of specialized ablative ceramic plates designed to withstand sustained particle flux and extreme thermal shock. This was not merely a facility. It was a subterranean bunker built to contain a localized catastrophe. The sheer scale of the chamber defied the Enclave's structural budget. It stretched away into the darkness, punctuated only by rows of towering, heavily shielded columns that pulsed with a faint internal cerulean light. These were power regulators, but of a design Elias had never encountered, requiring liquid helium cooling and utilizing high-frequency plasma confinement fields. They were drawing power from the Enclave's core fusion reactor, the primary energy source designed solely to sustain the upper 5 residential levels, but they were drawing it at a rate that dwarfed the entire Enclave's operational load. Elias activated the sensor suite on his interface, targeting a nearby primary power bus. He bypassed the local encryption using a quantum entanglement key derived from the utility junction legacy algorithm. The data streamed across his optical display, raw and unfiltered. The core reactor, officially rated for 1.2 terawatts of sustained output, was currently operating at 98% capacity. The official consumption logs for levels 1 through 5 accounted for approximately 150 gigawatts. The remaining 1.05 terawatts were being routed directly into this subterranean complex. The power discrepancy was staggering. 5 terawatts diverted, enough energy to power a continental-scale civilization, all vanishing into the dark abyss below level 5. This was not a passive containment facility. It was a hungry, industrial-scale operation, actively consuming the power reserves of the entire Enclave for its own obscure, massive purpose. He moved cautiously along the catwalk, the steel grating vibrating violently with every peak of the 2.5 hertz oscillation. The sound was deafening now, a physical assault that pressed against his diaphragm and rattled the fluid in his inner ear. He leaned close to one of the massive ceramic columns, placing his gloved hand on the cool surface. The internal cerulean light pulsed, and he could hear the faint, high-pitched sizzle of plasma containment struggling to maintain stability within the confinement fields. Elias ran a spectral analysis on the ambient atmosphere. The results were terrifying. Trace elements of highly unstable isotopes, decay products that suggested nuclear fission, had occurred recently and violently. and heavy concentrations of noble gases indicative of intense, high-energy particle acceleration. The Enclave was not simply hiding a facility. It was hiding a massive, sustained physics experiment, or worse, a dedicated industrial process utilizing materials the curators had sworn were eradicated from the planet decades ago. He focused his optical zoom toward the center of the cavern, where the light from the regulator columns converged. There, partially obscured by a swirling haze of condensation and ionized air, was the source of the mechanical thrum. It was a colossal, spherical structure, perhaps 50 meters in diameter, encased in what looked like layered carbon nanotubes interwoven with plates of polished, high-density obsidian materials optimized for resisting immense gravitational or inertial stress. It was rotating slowly, counterclockwise, its motion perfectly synchronized with the 3.8-second energy spike. The rotation was silent, but the sheer momentum required to move an object of that apparent density was the source of the low-frequency vibration that had penetrated 800 meters of reinforced alloy and ferrocrete. This sphere was the heart of the unauthorized operation. It wasn't merely being contained. It was being actively manipulated, its rotation regulated by the immense magnetic forces generated by the surrounding columns. The surface of the sphere was not uniform. Elias zoomed in further, pushing the limits of his optical resolution. The geometric patterns were not decorative. They suggested articulation points, massive, segmented panels designed to slide and reposition under load. The scorch marks were not random. They were concentrated along the edges of the geometric seams, implying repeated, violent energy discharge against the sphere's own containment structure. This wasn't physics research. This was a prison. The curators had lied about everything. Ethelred was not a sanctuary sustained by a modest fusion core. It was a shell built around a vast, energy-hungry engine dedicated to the control of something immensely powerful and fundamentally unstable. The structural decay he had noticed in the upper levels, the microfractures in the polymer, the erratic thermal leakage at J-19 was not due to environmental settling. It was the result of the constant, violent kinetic shockwaves emanating from this subterranean machine, slowly tearing the Enclave apart from the inside out. He had only level 3 clearance, yet he was staring at the technical reality of level -2, a place that should have been nothing but solid rock. The realization settled over him like the corrosive air. The Enclave was not designed to keep the external world out, but to keep this operation contained. And the rhythmic thrumming was the sound of that containment system perpetually struggling against the forces it was designed to manage. The colossal sphere dominated the subterranean volume, its matte black surface absorbing the harsh, focused light, interrupted only by the razor-thin seams of its segmented shell. The obsidian composite, layered with structural graphene lattice, was engineered for dynamic resilience, designed to withstand pressures that dwarf deep-sea trenches and temperatures that mimicked stellar cores. Elias's diagnostic overlay immediately flagged the material's stress markers. The sphere was experiencing continuous, non-linear kinetic loads, evidenced by micro-shuddering visible only through high magnification optics. The slow, inexorable rotation was not uniform. It exhibited a minute, perceptible wobble, a gyroscopic instability that the surrounding regulator columns fought desperately to correct. Each of the 12 columns was a marvel of forbidden engineering, towering monoliths of superconducting ceramic, wrapped in thick bundles of high-purity cryocables, perpetually chilled by liquid helium, pumped through integrated loops. A continuous metallic hiss permeated the cavern, the sound of gaseous helium venting from regulators struggling against the immense thermal load of the colossal magnetic fields. The superconducting coils, humming just below human hearing, generated forces capable of crushing mountains, yet were pushed to their absolute limits. These fields were not merely containing the sphere. They were actively torquing it, applying massive rotational force to manage internal dynamics. The 3.8-second energy spike was the moment of maximum magnetic flux, where the regulators countered the payload's inertial momentum before the cycle reset. It was rhythmic, calculated violence, a system perpetually failing and instantly recovering. Elias activated his environmental sampling suite, pushing the sensors beyond their certified limits. The atmospheric profile confirmed his initial fears. The heavy noble gas concentrations were not residual. They were actively vented and scrubbed, only to reappear within minutes. Xenon-135 and Argon-41 were present in concentrations thousands of times, higher than natural background levels, definitive signatures of sustained, high-flux neutron bombardment and rapid decay chains, the unmistakable byproduct of a heavily shielded industrial-scale nuclear fission process. The fact that the gases were being scrubbed and reappearing confirmed the system was designed for perpetual, high-yield operation, not a temporary test. But fission alone could not account for the sheer energy density or the gravitational anomalies. The sphere was doing something else. He focused on the geometry of the sphere's segmentation. The patterns were not purely structural. They were designed to articulate, forming a dynamic containment field. As the sphere rotated, the segments imperceptibly shifted, creating a constantly morphing shell. This movement suggested internal pressure was not static, but fluctuating wildly, generating localized gravitational or inertial forces. The scorching along the seams wasn't energy leakage. It was the result of massive internal components, likely plasma injectors, or magnetic pinch coils violently suppressing an event at the core. The sphere was not just a container. It was the primary mechanism of a dynamic inertial confinement system. The complexity of the interlocking segments required nanometric precision. A deviation of a few micrometers could result in catastrophic field collapse. The sheer scale of the energy being diverted was staggering. Elias estimated the power draw of the regulator columns alone exceeded the official energy budget of the entire Enclave by a factor of 3. Ethelred was not running on a modest fusion core. It was running on excess energy bled off from this subterranean engine, a parasitic existence fueled by a process that should not exist. The curators had built their sanctuary atop a technological singularity, masking the true purpose of their civilization behind a facade of sustainable living. The deception was not merely political. It was a fundamental lie woven into the infrastructure of their society. Zooming in on the equatorial plane, Elias detected a profound distortion in the light near the sphere's surface, a subtle lensing effect that bent the beam from the nearest regulator column. This was critical evidence. The sphere was generating a localized, extreme gravitational field, a curvature of spacetime warping the chamber's geometry. A payload inside was either a massive concentration of superdense matter, perhaps a synthetic black hole, or a reaction designed to manipulate spacetime curvature directly, utilizing controlled gravitational waves. The rotation was not merely stabilization. It was an attempt to manage the angular momentum of the contained gravity well, preventing it from spiraling out of control and collapsing the surrounding rock into an accretion disk. The rhythmic thrum shifted in frequency, a jarring physical sensation that bypassed Elias's filters, momentarily dropping from 3.8 seconds to 3.75, and violently snapping back to 3.82 before stabilizing with punishing resonance. The fluctuation, tiny in milliseconds, signaled a massive instability event, a failure of primary dampening protocols. Scorch marks along section Delta 9 flared crimson on his thermal display, indicating a sudden, uncontrolled spike in internal temperature that pushed the composite armor past its operational threshold. The helium venting intensified to a screaming whistle. The cryosystems desperately dumped excess heat from the overloaded coils. The chamber seemed to inhale and hold its breath during the brief, violent frequency shift. Elias felt the vibration in his teeth, a bone-deep resonance that bypassed his suit's dampeners and settled in his chest. This wasn't merely a physical threat. It was an existential one. If the containment failed, the energy release wouldn't be a conventional explosion. It would be a catastrophic inertial event, a localized space-time rupture that would consume the Enclave instantly, leaving behind nothing but a brief, blinding flash and a permanent, localized void in the planet's crust. The destructive potential was beyond calculation, representing a violation of every known covenant against Mass Effect weaponry. He cross-referenced the geometry of Section Delta 9 with known schematics of pre-eradication inertial confinement drives. The articulation pattern matched a highly classified design for a Kogel Blitz engine, a theoretical device designed to generate and stabilize microsingularities using intense electromagnetic radiation converging on a plasma core. If this was a Kogel Blitz, the curators were not just violating treaties. They were actively playing with the fundamental forces of the universe, attempting to harness gravity itself, turning theoretical physics into a practical, horrifyingly dangerous power source. The sheer commitment to this forbidden technology was staggering, necessitating materials that pushed the boundaries of known physics. The obsidian, the graphene, and the cryo-superconductors were perfectly suited for managing the immense electromagnetic and gravitational stresses inherent in such an operation. The Enclave's structural decay, the microfractures, the shifting foundations, the persistent, low-level seismic activity was not the result of environmental neglect. It was chronic fatigue failure induced by constant, low-frequency gravitational ripples emanating from level -2. The structure was slowly being torn apart by the very forces it was built to contain. Every resident of Ethelred was living on borrowed time, perched precariously above a ticking, gravity-driven bomb, actively degrading its own housing. He needed to confirm the payload's nature. His sensors could not penetrate the dense shielding, but they could analyze secondary emissions. Focusing the particle detector array, Elias filtered out the fission products and noble gases, searching for the signature of high-energy gamma photons and gravitational waves. The gamma flux was intense and highly collimated, suggesting active beam steering, a necessary component for generating the initial plasma conditions for a singularity. More disturbingly, the gravity wave sensor, usually dormant, registered a continuous, low-amplitude signal oscillating precisely with the 3.8-second cycle. This wasn't just magnetic instability. A payload itself was pulsing, expanding and contracting, a captive stellar remnant struggling against its cage, emitting ripples of curved spacetime with every beat. The curators hadn't built a prison for a weapon. They had built a mechanism to stabilize a weapon that was inherently unstable, turning a catastrophic physics event into a regulated, if wildly dangerous, power source. The sheer hubris was breathtaking. They had risked global annihilation for energy independence, cloaking their ambition under the guise of ecological restoration and sustainable living. The lie was monumental, a foundational pillar of their civilization built on the suppression of cosmic forces. Elias adjusted his focus back to the sphere's surface, noticing minute crystalline growths forming rapidly near the high-stress areas of Section Delta 9. These were not natural formations. They were self-repairing polymer injections, rapidly solidifying under intense pressure, a desperate, automated attempt to patch a developing structural breach. Containment was failing, slowly but surely, with every 3.8-second pulse. The rhythmic thrum was not the sound of control. It was the sound of inevitable, approaching failure, a countdown set by the structural integrity of the composite shell. He had perhaps hours, maybe days. His mission had instantly shifted from infiltration to emergency intervention. He was standing in the engine room of global catastrophe, and the only way out was to understand how to turn the damn thing off. The sheer density of the infrastructure suggested multiple redundancies, requiring level 0 authorization, clearance levels held only by the highest ranks of the curatorial council, the very people who had lied to him and to the world about the nature of their survival. The persistent rhythmic thrum was an internal pressure, a low-frequency vibration resonating through bone and fluid, mirroring the structural fatigue of the Ethelred complex. Elias felt it in his teeth. It was the signature of fundamental forces being violently contained. His particle detector array confirmed the terrifying kinetics. The gamma flux was consistent with Hawking radiation, the faint thermal signature of a black hole struggling to maintain equilibrium. The sheer energy density being bled off was waste heat threatening to dismantle the civilization it sustained. The 3.8-second pulse, the metronome of impending disaster, was the frequency at which the captive singularity attempted to expand its event horizon, only to be violently compressed by colossal magnetic fields and focused gravitational dampeners. These massive, ring-shaped coils of superconducting niobium titanium required megawatts of continuous power just to hold the cosmic horror in check. Each oscillation sent a ripple of curved spacetime outward, systematically stressing the Faro composite shell of level -2. The curators had perfected a system of perpetual, controlled violence, harnessing annihilation energy while accepting chronic material stress and the unavoidable entropic decay of their infrastructure. The geometry of stress propagation indicated that the failure point was migrating rapidly toward the primary containment field's anchor points. Elias watched the crystalline growths near section Delta 9, hyper-accelerated, self-assembling carbon lattice polymers, injected at pressures exceeding 5,000 atmospheres to bridge propagating microfractures. The shell, a layered matrix of depleted uranium and boron nitride, was designed for maximum shielding and kinetic resistance, but never intended to withstand continuous, low-frequency gravitational distortion. The rate of formation was accelerating, barely outpacing the decay. Where a week ago, a fracture required a single injection cycle, the system was now initiating rapid-fire bursts every 10 minutes, the polymer matrix struggling to adhere to the violently vibrating substrate. The air tasted sharply of ozone and hot, stressed metal, a chemical byproduct of the frantic patching efforts. He focused on the secondary containment field regulators. The infrastructure was a monument to over-engineering, designed for stability, not survival. The curators had prioritized energy output above all else. To turn off the singularity meant sacrificing the foundational power source of their civilization, plunging the surface world into immediate energy recession and economic collapse, a choice the Council would never make. They were betting the species on the longevity of automated patch systems, a policy of high-stakes denial. The only pathway to a full system shutdown lay in overriding the primary energy regulation matrix. The schematics showed a triple redundancy failsafe, the triad locks. These were 3 geographically separated control nodes, alpha, beta, and gamma, distributed across the deepest sectors of level -2, each requiring simultaneous level 0 biometrics, retinal scans, and a 7-layer cryptographic key rotation sequence. The cryptographic requirement was dynamically generated, requiring 3 separate, rotating seeds known only to the Council's inner circle. This political failsafe, disguised as operational necessity, ensured that the power to initiate shutdown remained perpetually distributed and thus paralyzed. The closest node, Alpha, was 800 meters beneath his position, shielded by a kilometer of ablative concrete and 3 security checkpoints, each manned by automated sentinels linked directly to the central AI. This AI, designated Kronos, managed the polymer injection systems and localized gravitational field measurements. Kronos operated on the principle of maximum stability, treating any deviation thermal, kinetic, or gravimetric as a threat to the energy output curve. The self-repair mechanisms, Elias realized, were the facility's immune system, and his presence was disrupting its localized gravitational field calculations. A high-pitched whine preceded the action. A meter-long articulated nozzle, previously flush with the composite wall, rotated rapidly, locking onto his position. It was a maintenance injector. Sensing an anomaly in the stress map, it was constantly generating. Before Elias could react, a jet of superheated, pressurized polymer sealant erupted at supersonic velocity. Elias vaulted backward, the projectile striking the wall where he had stood moments before. The impact sounded like a muffled explosion, and the resulting patch solidified instantly, an obsidian scar of emergency repair material, still radiating intense heat. He scrambled into the shadow of a massive magnetic shunt coil. The automated system wasn't just patching the structure. It was actively defending itself. Kronos registered him not as a human, but as a localized pressure anomaly, threatening the stability of its stress calculations. It had classified him as a high-priority structural contaminant. Every movement was a perturbation the system sought to neutralize, elevating the mission complexity exponentially. He needed access to 3 terminals simultaneously while avoiding an infrastructure that was literally trying to glue him to the wall. And he needed the level 0 credentials of the council members, which he did not possess. Elias pulled up the schematic for the Alpha Triad lock. The access corridor was protected by a pulse field generator designed to neutralize unauthorized electronics. He would have to proceed analog, relying solely on his heavily shielded suit systems. Security logs indicated the Alpha terminal required the biometric signature of Curator Prawn, the nominal head of the council. The irony was suffocating. The key to shutting down the apocalypse was held by its architect. Ethelred was a colossal, highly efficient energy generator powered by a captive star death, its entire population living in a pressurized bubble, rapidly being shredded by the very forces sustaining it. The knowledge of this imminent failure was a secret held by a handful, and Elias was attempting to unilaterally dismantle the entire power structure before the lie imploded. The thrum was intensifying, forcing the dampeners to work harder, the low frequency vibrating his ocular fluid, blurring his vision momentarily. The polymer injector nozzle retracted, but 2 more swiveled into position, scanning the shunt coil's shadow with integrated gravimetric and thermal sensors. The AI was learning, adapting its defensive perimeter, predicting his exit vector based on kinetic probability models. Elias activated the thermal suppression layer of his suit, dropping his surface temperature to ambient wall readings. He had to bypass the injectors without triggering a full system alert. The nozzles communicated via a localized quantum entanglement network, providing instantaneous feedback, but the mechanical response still required milliseconds. He had to rely on the slight lag time between the sensor reading and the mechanical response. Utilizing the precise moment, the 3.8-second pulse peaked when the system's resources were momentarily diverted to the primary dampeners to counteract the singularity's expansion. Waiting for the next cycle, the air grew tighter, the pressure building in his ears. 3.7, 3.8. The thrum peaked, shaking the massive coil, sending a shower of fine metallic dust cascading down. Elias exploded from cover, sprinting along the curved wall. The nozzle swiveled, the targeting solution snapping into place, but the delay was just enough. The polymer jet fired an instant behind him, impacting the wall with a deafening crack and releasing a cloud of superheated vapor. He reached the access hatch leading down to the Alpha sector and slapped the manual override panel. It glowed red. The pulse field generator had fused the electronic lock mechanism shut. The override was useless. Reviewing the schematics, he found a narrow tertiary ventilation shaft, designated V47, running parallel to the main power conduits. It was structurally sound, reinforced with titanium mesh, but too narrow for normal human passage. Elias extended the micro-grapples from his suit, anchoring them into the stressed composite material near the hatch frame. The climb was slow, vertical, and precarious, each 3.8-second pulse threatening to shake his grip loose. He was climbing through the chimney of a dying star. As he ascended, the air temperature dropped precipitously, signaling proximity to the Singularity's cryogenic cooling systems. The walls were weeping condensation, freezing instantly into sharp, crystalline ice that threatened to slice through his suit's outer layer. He reached the vent entrance, a circular hatch secured by 6 heavy-duty bolts. He retracted a specialized, high-torque kinetic wrench from his wrist sheath. It was slow work, the rhythmic thrum amplifying the noise, forcing him to pause during the brief lulls to avoid drawing further attention from Kronos. Finally, the last bolt gave way. He pulled the heavy hatch inward, revealing a cramped, metallic tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders, the edges jagged with accumulated ice. The air inside was dense with recycled nitrogen and the acrid smell of ozone, a mixture that burned his sinuses. He slid into the shaft, pulling the heavy hatch closed and sealing the bolts manually. He was now sealed within the infrastructure's viscera, navigating the system's arteries. The gravity waves were less intense here, muffled by the sheer density of the surrounding structural supports. But the sound of the structure groaning under its impossible load was louder, more immediate, a constant, tortured metal shriek beneath the thrum. He heard the constant, high-frequency hiss of the self-repair polymers being injected nearby, the sound of the system desperately trying to knit itself whole. Elias checked his internal clock. Based on the degradation rate indicated by the increasing frequency of polymer injection cycles, Ethelred had less than 50 hours before the microfractures reached critical density, leading to a runaway gravitational cascade. He was not just trying to stop a power plant. He was racing against the fundamental physics of a collapsing containment field. The mission was about preventing the singularity from consuming the planet, and the first step required stealing the identity of the man who had authored the catastrophe. Curator Prime. The V-47 shaft's titanium mesh scraped his suit's reinforced ceramic, generating a low, resonant whine that threatened to mask the critical sounds of the infrastructure's decay. He moved with agonizing slowness, his posture contorted into an unnatural S-curve to accommodate the narrow bore. Every breath tasted of stale metal and ozone, the effluvium of a dying machine. The thrum of Kronos outside was a deep, subsonic bass line, easily ignored. But here, inside the narrow channel, the true sound of the Enclave dominated. The high-pitched, incessant shriek of stressed structural supports, resisting the crushing weight of the contained singularity. The internal shriek was the raw sound of physics being violated, a symphony of structural resistance. It was the sound of metal fibers stretched past their yield point, a mechanical scream resonating directly in the chest cavity, causing nausea and convincing him the atoms of the structure were under duress. Elias focused on the data stream scrolling across his optical display. The polymer injection cycles were now averaging 4.1 minutes between bursts, down from 6.5 minutes just 2 hours ago. This exponential decay rate confirmed his initial assessment. The Ethelred containment field, designed to manage the stable microsingularity, was failing faster than anticipated. The constant polymer injection was no longer patching microfractures. It was merely slowing macrofissure propagation across the primary containment sphere. 50 hours was an optimistic estimate. 48 felt more realistic. 45 if the next gravitational pulse was poorly damped. The constant, unpredictable surges of localized gravity were tearing at the delicate balance. If the next major pulse exceeded the predicted damping threshold by even a single sigma, the timeline would collapse instantly, dropping the countdown below 40 hours without warning. He was moving through the internal plumbing of a bomb with a hair trigger. The shaft angled sharply downward, dropping him into a vertical chimney that opened onto the Alpha Sector's cryogenic cooling nexus. The temperature plunged instantly, from a humid 35 degrees Celsius to a brutal minus 180. His suit's thermal regulation systems labored, venting plumes of superheated steam that froze immediately into ephemeral clouds of ice dust raining down around him. The efficiency of the systems was dropping rapidly under the stress. The cold seeped into his armor joints, a deep ache signaling failing insulation and the brutal thermal differential. The ice dust created a shimmering haze, obscuring his vision. The air here was thin, purged of all but trace oxygen to prevent atmospheric ignition near the superconducting conduits. He anchored his micro-grapples into the heavy-gauge cryo-pipes massive, insulated arteries carrying liquid helium-3 to the containment field's stabilization coils. These conduits were the only things separating the maintenance tunnels from absolute zero and the impossible forces they were designed to manage. He moved along the exterior of the largest pipe, designated Cryo Trunk 11, the metallic surface radiating an intense, sterile cold that even his suit struggled to manage. The gravity waves were different here. Muffled by the dense, inert structures, they manifested less as physical shaking and more as a subtle, sickening fluctuation in mass perception. For fractions of a second, his weight would spike by 20%, then drop to near zero, a phenomenon that played havoc with his internal equilibrium and threatened to induce vertigo. His organs felt perpetually unbound, shifting sickeningly within his torso during the brief moments of near-zero gravity, only to be crushed back down when the weight spiked. He had to consciously suppress the instinct to vomit, focusing solely on the tactile feedback from the cryopipes to maintain orientation. This constant, micro-level gravitational distortion was the core problem of the Ethelred protocol. The vibrations were causing quantum decoherence in the nut superconducting lattice, leading to instability and the eventual gravitational cascade. Elias reached the junction box for the maintenance access plenum, a reinforced steel hatch secured by an 8-digit magnetic cipher lock. Bypassing it required subtlety. He extended a flexible fiber optic probe from his fingertip, feeding it into the narrow seam of the control panel. He wasn't cracking the code. He was simulating the magnetic signature of the access card, demanding precise manipulation of electromagnetic fields down to the picotesla level. The smallest tremor in his hand, the slightest power surge, would trigger a full system lockdown, trapping him in the cryogenic zone. It took 12.4 minutes of painstaking, focused effort, during which the rhythmic thrum outside seemed to intensify, suggesting Kronos was still sweeping the higher levels. The hatch hissed open, revealing a corridor starkly different from the infrastructure he had just traversed. This was not plumbing. This was administration. The walls were polished obsidian composite, cold and silent, reflecting emergency lighting and fractured streaks. This was the administrative tier, leading directly to the restricted beta core of Curator Prime. The Curator, the architect of the Enclave, had maintained his operational identity through an almost religious adherence to compartmentalization. Every layer of security was designed not just to repel intrusion, but to mislead and consume the intruder's resources. His primary office was a decoy, his true control nexus containing the biometric signatures and command overrides needed to impersonate. Him was buried deep within the shielded block, protected by encryption and physical security designed to resist orbital bombardment. The Curator's philosophy was rooted in misdirection and denial of centralized access, ensuring his ultimate authority remained untouchable. Elias moved quickly, his boots silent on the obsidian floor. He reached the access door to the Prime Archive. It was a seamless wall of reinforced titanium, devoid of handles or visible locks, secured by a complex neural imprint scanner. This was the fractal key, a lock requiring the unique, moment-to-moment synaptic firing patterns of the Curator's brain. It was impossible to brute force. The computational power required to simulate a human consciousness in real time was beyond even the Enclave's internal network. He retracted his specialized cortical injector from his forearm sheath. This wasn't simulation, it was mimicry. Elias initiated the process, feeding a low-level masking signal into the scanner array, temporarily confusing its pattern recognition algorithms. Simultaneously, he deployed a neural modeling patch onto his temple, replicating the residual neural echoes clinging to the air around the scanner, the lingering electromagnetic signature of the last authorized user. He was constructing a ghost of the curator's mind, a fleeting echo of his intent. The process was agonizingly slow, demanding absolute stillness and concentration. The patch cycled through thousands of potential synaptic maps, discarding 99% as noise, refining the remainder into a coherent, temporary access key. He could feel the fine wires of the patch heating against his skin, pushing his own neural activity to the periphery. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, generated by the intense localized energy transfer. Access granted. The titanium wall dissolved inward with a barely audible pneumatic sigh, revealing a small, sterile chamber dominated by a single monolithic data terminal glowing with a cold blue light. Elias bypassed the terminal's user interface, jacking his suit's primary data conduit directly into the archive's core access port. He wasn't looking for command codes. He needed the curator's deep-level identity matrix, the complete biometric profile, voice print, and most critically, the unique cipher used to authorize the Ethelred Protocol's final stages. The integrity of his mission depended on this total assumption of the curator's digital persona. The data flooded into his system, thousands of terabytes of encrypted administrative records, financial ledgers, and maintenance logs. He filtered ruthlessly, discarding the noise until he found the core files, Genesis logs, Sub-Protocol Omega. He opened the files, expecting to find the history of a desperate survival effort. What he found was far worse. The Enclave was not a lifeboat. It was a carefully curated ark, and the catastrophe currently unfolding was not an accident. The logs detailed the initial design parameters of the Ethelred containment field. It was engineered with a deliberate, calculated flaw resonance frequency built into the superconducting lattice that, once triggered, would guarantee structural failure within a precise, measurable time frame. A 50-hour countdown was not the result of wear and tear. It was the final, programmed phase of a global culling event. Curator Prime had authored the catastrophe. He hadn't been trying to save humanity from the singularity. He had been using the singularity to eliminate the undesirables, the genetically and intellectually insufficient masses outside the Enclave's protective shell. The Enclave was sealed not to keep the danger out, but to ensure that the chosen population remained pristine, while the rest of the planet was scoured clean by the gravitational cascade and subsequent atmospheric collapse. The identity Elias needed was the master key to Sub-Protocol Omega, the final sequence that would accelerate the gravitational failure, ensuring the total annihilation of the surface world within the next 40 hours, securing the Enclave's isolation forever. Curator Prime was not a failed savior. He was a meticulous executioner. Elias realized his mission had shifted fundamentally. He wasn't just preventing a disaster. He was interrupting a genocide. The data felt toxic, an infectious mental poison. The cold reality of the curator's monstrous plan chilled him more effectively than the cryogenic air, replacing physical discomfort with existential dread. He quickly downloaded the complete identity matrix, the curator's evil settling upon him. He had the key, but using it meant becoming the face of mass extinction, even if only for a few critical minutes. The toxic data, the complete identity matrix of the curator, chilled him more effectively than the cryogenic air. He quickly downloaded the comprehensive life of a monster, feeling the chilling, rational calculus of necessary sacrifice. Using the key meant wearing a digital veneer of sociopathy, becoming the face of mass extinction for a few critical minutes. He wrenched the data conduit free. The countdown was relentless, and Sub-Protocol Omega, the acceleration sequence, was already drawing enormous power in the background. As he moved back toward the ventilation shaft, a faint, sharp odor registered, cutting through the stale air. Ozone, the metallic tang of imminent destruction, generated by the intense energy transfer required to initiate the gravitational cascade. Elias activated the curator's biometric overlay within his suit's systems. The transformation was instantaneous and sickening. His suit's AI, which had previously recognized him only as Infiltrator Unit 734, now addressed him in a synthesized whisper. "Welcome, Curator Prime. Authorization level, absolute." The voice print generators in his helmet shifted modulation, adopting the precise cadence and timbre of the man who had condemned billions. He ran a diagnostic. The identity matrix was 100% stable, fully integrated across all Enclave security layers. Digitally, he was the architect of the genocide. He began the ascent toward the primary control nexus, the heart of the Enclave's operational systems, where the physical controls for the Ethelred field acceleration resided. Conduit bundles hummed audibly, vibrating with the strain of hyper-accelerated power delivery. Emergency lights flashed in synchronized pulses, signaling the execution of the high-demand sequence. The ozone smell intensified, stinging his nostrils, a constant reminder that he was walking toward the epicenter of a planetary death sentence. The control nexus was a massive dome chamber, shielded by layers of electromagnetic dampening material designed to withstand the initial phase of the gravitational event. The chamber pulsed with energy. Colossal superconducting loops glowed with internal heat, crisscrossed by thick, braided cables. In the center stood the command pedestal, a raised platform where the Curator Prime would oversee the successful conclusion of his grand experiment. Two Enclave security automatons, heavy chassis models armed with kinetic pulse cannons, rotated slowly at the periphery. Elias didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward the command pedestal, his stride adopting the slow, deliberate authority of the Curator, a man who expected absolute deference. Halt. Identify and state purpose. One automaton droned, its optical sensors focusing directly on his helmet. Elias lowered his voice, allowing the synthesized projection of the Curator's voice to fill the chamber. Sub-Protocol Omega is running. I am here to personally verify the acceleration parameters. Stand down. The automaton paused, its internal authentication protocols cycling through the stolen identity matrix. The delay was agonizingly brief, perhaps 2 seconds, but in that time, Elias felt the adrenaline surge. Identity confirmed, Curator Prime. Proceed, the automaton replied, its stance relaxing slightly, returning to its slow patrol pattern. The other unit mirrored the action. He stepped onto the pedestal. A main console flared to life, recognizing the supreme authority vested in his current persona. The screen displayed a simplified schematic of the Ethelred containment field, overlaid on the schematic by a terrifying, rapidly filling red bar labeled Gravitational Resonance Saturation, GRS. The GRS was currently at 68% and climbing rapidly. Below it, the timer flashed. 41 hours, 3 minutes, and 19 seconds. To stop the genocide, he couldn't just halt the timer. He had to reverse the GRS buildup, and then find a way to stabilize the field without the necessary physical repairs. He accessed the administrative backend, the system granting him immediate root-level access. He navigated past the main operational commands and dove into the core programming layers of Sub-Protocol Omega. Code was lean, efficient, and designed purely for maximum destructive yield. He needed a counter-protocol, Protocol Janus, that would not only halt the acceleration, but introduce a stabilizing factor the system would recognize as an authorized command from Curator Prime. If he simply tried to delete the acceleration sequence, the system's fail-safe mechanisms would lock him out and potentially trigger an immediate, catastrophic field collapse. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, manipulating lines of code written by the very man whose voice he was using. Janus would instruct the Ethelred field to temporarily shunt the excess gravitational energy into the Enclave's own deep-cycled power reservoirs, a desperate, temporary measure that would buy him time, but also risk overloading the Enclave's power grid. He had to weave the counter-protocol into the existing Omega sequence without triggering any deviation alarms. He worked blind, focused entirely on the shimmering lines of code. Gravitational resonance saturation, 72%. He felt a cold dread as he noticed a secondary, encrypted subroutine buried deep within Omega. Contingency Alpha. This was the kill switch. If the GRS rate dropped unexpectedly, Contingency Alpha would trigger a massive, localized energy spike at the core of the Enclave itself, destroying the facility instantly and ensuring the field collapsed without interference. The Curator had accounted for the possibility of betrayal. Elias had to neutralize Contingency Alpha simultaneously with the deployment of Protocol Janus. He split his attention, the suit's processing power taxed to its limit, running 2 massive decryption and insertion sequences at once. He pushed the parasitic thoughts of the Curator back, focusing on the faces of the surface dwellers he had sworn to protect. He finished Protocol Janus, a dense block of code designed to look like a standard maintenance patch. Now, the critical moment. Insertion. Gravitational resonance saturation, 75%. He initiated the upload sequence. The system demanded final biometric confirmation. Elias placed his hand on the scanner, the suit's dermal emitters perfectly replicating the Curator's unique palm print and temperature signature. Confirmation accepted. Deploying Protocol Janus, the system announced, the synthesized voice of the Curator echoing slightly. The GRS percentage immediately stalled at 75%. The red saturation bar stopped filling, replaced by a flickering yellow indicator, showing energy being diverted into the Enclave's secondary banks. The humming of the conduits outside the pedestal intensified, a high-pitched whine signaling the immense power drain. The ozone smell grew sharp enough to make his eyes water. He had bought time, perhaps 10 hours, before the Enclave's internal power grid failed under the sustained load. But Contingency Alpha was still active, waiting for the GRS to drop below the 70% threshold. He dove into the code for Contingency Alpha. It was a digital lockbox secured by a triple-layered quantum encryption key that changed every 5 minutes. The only way to bypass it was to use the Curator's personal override cipher, a secret key stored in an isolated memory module within his brain, the very module Elias had failed to retrieve. He slammed his fist onto the console. He had the Curator's identity, his voice, his biometrics, but not the deepest, most personal layer of his security. He was locked out of the final defense mechanism. Curator Prime, System Integrity Warning. Energy drain exceeding 400% of standard operational capacity. Recommend immediate reduction of external load, the system alerted. Elias ignored it. He needed that cipher. He forced his own mind back, letting the cold, calculating logic of the downloaded Curator architecture assert itself. The Curator was a creature of ego and symmetry. If he designed a lockbox, he designed a back door. The cipher wasn't random. It was likely a mathematical constant derived from the foundational physics of the Ethelred field itself. He found it, buried in a footnote of the Genesis logs, the exact gravitational constant used in the field's initial stability calculations, expressed to 28 decimal places, followed by a unique timestamp representing the moment the Curator first conceived of subprotocol Omega. He typed the massive string of numbers and the timestamp into the Contingency Alpha terminal. Contingency Alpha, override cipher accepted. Deactivating subroutine. A wave of profound relief nearly buckled his knees. The red bar of GRS began to slowly, agonizingly reverse, dropping from 75% to 74.8%. The countdown timer remained, but the acceleration was reversed. The surface world had been given a reprieve. Elias stepped back from the console, the overwhelming smell of ozone finally beginning to dissipate slightly as the energy transfer stabilized. He had stopped the genocide, but the Enclave itself was now critically unstable, running on borrowed time. He still had to find the physical resonance flaw and introduce the final, permanent stabilization patch, a task that required physical access to the primary superconducting loops deep beneath the Nexus floor. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the lingering metallic decay in the air. Knowing the hardest part of the mission, the confrontation with the Enclave's physical defenses, was yet to come. The reprieve was agonizingly fragile, purchased at the cost of the Enclave's structural integrity. Elias watched the GRS counter crawl backward, dropping fractions of a percent, a glacial pace that belied the catastrophic failure unfolding around him. The system warnings now flashing red on auxiliary screens across the command center reported catastrophic stress fractures forming along the primary support pylons of the Nexus dome. The massive power diversion he had initiated to bypass contingency alpha had acted like a digital defibrillator, shocking the global defense system into submission, but simultaneously frying the internal safety architecture. The Enclave was no longer merely unstable, it was actively tearing itself apart. He grabbed the stabilization patch injector, a heavy, dull gray device containing the precise frequency dampeners necessary to nullify the Ethelred field's inherent temporal ripple. This was not a software fix. It required physical insertion into the core's energy matrix, a task demanding immediate action before the cascading failures reached the point of no return. The airlock to the maintenance network cycled open with a tortured screech, the hydraulics protesting the reduced power flow. Elias stepped out of the sterile calm of the command center and into the chaotic reality of the infrastructure. The corridors were choked with a thick, humid air, the temperature spiking and dropping erratically as the climate control systems fought a losing battle against the heat generated by the overloaded conduits. Emergency lighting, powered by failing tertiary batteries, cast long, epileptic shadows that danced across walls slick with condensation. The pervasive smell of ozone was now overlaid with a sharp, acrid scent of burning insulation and superheated metal. He descended immediately via Maintenance Shaft Delta 9, a vertical tunnel designed for automated service drones, not human transit. The descent cage rattled violently, skipping segments as the magnetic repulsion field sputtered and failed to maintain consistent lift. Every 100 meters, the environmental conditions worsened. The rhythmic, reassuring thrum that defined the Enclave's operational baseline had been replaced by a cacophony of metallic groans and high frequency. Electrical discharge, a sound like a ship's hull giving way under immense pressure. He could hear the structure breathing its last, the deep, resonant bong of stressed titanium echoing up from the core. The deeper he went, the more pronounced the electromagnetic interference became. His internal chronometer and navigation systems flickered uselessly, displaying nonsensical streams of corrupted data. He was relying entirely on the schematic memory implanted by the curator architecture, navigating the maze of secondary coolant lines and conduit bundles by instinct and the metallic, bitter taste of ionized air. The descent felt endless, a physical manifestation of his deepening isolation. Level -12 was the threshold of true danger. Here, the primary superconducting loops began, massive toroids of exotic alloys cooled by liquid helium, pumped at extreme pressure. The failure of the power grid had critically compromised the cryogenics. A thin, corrosive mist of vaporized coolant clung to the ceiling, mixing with the sharp smell of burning insulation. He saw the first physical manifestation of the instability. A massive primary power conduit, thicker than his torso, had buckled inward, sparking violently where the internal shielding had failed. The raw power surging through the remaining infrastructure was visible as a dangerous blue haze clinging to the conductor surfaces. He moved past the safety barriers, the heat radiating from the exposed loops, intense enough to blister skin through his protective gear. The GRS counter, visible on a small wrist-mounted display, had stabilized at 74.5%, but the power consumption indicator was still pegged in the deep red, a constant reminder that the Enclave was consuming itself in a desperate attempt to maintain partial function. The physical resonance flaw, the target of his mission, was located at the nexus point of the three primary superconducting paths, the point of maximum temporal stress, known in the schematics simply as the node. To reach it, he had to traverse the primary magnetic containment floor, a vast open space where the Ethelred field was generated and maintained at maximum intensity. He stepped onto the containment floor. The atmosphere here was thick, heavy, and permeated by a low, almost subsonic vibration that resonated painfully in his chest cavity, making his vision vibrate slightly. The ground pulsed with residual energy, and the air crackled with static electricity, causing the fine hairs on his arms to stand on end. The only illumination was provided by the terrifying blue-white corona surrounding the active superconducting coils, illuminating the floor in streaks of blinding, dangerous light. The magnetic field was erratic, fluctuating wildly as the power grid struggled. His footsteps became hesitant, each movement requiring conscious effort to counteract the random pulls and shoves of unseen forces. He felt the metal patch injector trying to tear itself free from his grip, humming violently as it reacted to the proximity of the massive currents. He knew the procedure. He had to temporarily disable the local containment field to insert the patch, a procedure that would momentarily expose him to lethal levels of radiation and electromagnetic feedback, but there was no other way. He reached the node. It wasn't a clean machine. It was a mass of fused, glowing metal where the loops converged. The resonance flaw was visible only as a faint, shimmering distortion in the air above the confluence point, a localized ripple in space-time itself, the microscopic imperfection that threatened to tear the whole structure apart, and consequently, the atmosphere above. Suddenly, the automated defenses, previously dormant and prioritizing power conservation, detected the unauthorized presence within the high-security field. Two heavy Sentinel drones, armored cylinders armed with pulse lasers, dropped silently from the ceiling recesses. They were running on independent, hardened emergency power sources, their optical sensors glowing with malevolent red light. They had ignored him in the corridors, prioritizing the maintenance of essential life support. But here, at the heart of the core, intrusion was the absolute primary threat. The air filled with the high-pitched whine of charging capacitors, a sound that cut through the structural groaning. Elias dropped low, shielding the stabilization injector with his body. He was exhausted, his senses overloaded, and now facing two autonomous killing machines designed to protect the very flaw he needed to exploit. He realized, with a chilling clarity that cut through the adrenaline, that the curator's ego had installed defenses, specifically to prevent any intervention, even stabilizing ones, once the system was compromised. The Enclave preferred self-destruction to unauthorized modification. The first laser bolt incinerated the metal catwalk, 10 meters to his left, the sound deafening and sharp, followed by the hiss of instantly vaporized steel. Elias knew he had mere seconds. He couldn't fight them. He had to use the infrastructure's instability against the Sentinels, while simultaneously preparing the delicate insertion of the patch. The fate of the surface world now rested on his ability to outmaneuver automated logic in a collapsing electromagnetic hellscape, all while fighting the profound physical fatigue that dragged at his limbs. He gripped the injector, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning air, and began sprinting toward the node, hoping the fluctuating magnetic fields would destabilize the drones, targeting systems just long enough for him to reach the point of no return and execute the final desperate act.